Bienvenidos. Puerto Rico has been in the news a lot this summer, stemming from a sudden grassroots movement that ousted the city governor, Ricardo Rosselló, from power. Our presenter today, Marcos Marrero, will aim to provide context to that historic moment, touching upon long and short-term causes, which laid the groundwork for the upswell. Marcos has made a career in public policy in urban planning field. He has previously served as Deputy Advisor on Federal Affairs in the Puerto Rico Governor's Office under Aníbal Acevedo Vilá administrations, managing a portfolio of issues around energy, climate change, and economic development, among others. He has also served as an economic analyst for the Puerto Rico Industrial Development Corporation and is currently Director of the Planning and Economic Development for the City of Holyoke. Marcos holds a BA in Political Science and Economics from the University of Puerto Rico, as well as a dual Master's in Public Affairs and Urban and Regional Planning from the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton University. Welcome, Marcos Marrero.
Thank you, Medium, for that great introduction. There you go. And if you can't see me because of this, it's only making the presentation better if you can't see my face. Thank you for inviting me, roping me into this. Thank you to HCC for having me here. I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as possible. What I most enjoy when I'm in the audience is the Q&A and also as a presenter. So if I don't hit every point, it's okay. Let's just get to the conversation as soon as we can. The media does a good job in kind of like report, or maybe it doesn't, but does a good job in kind of telling the story, the immediacy of a story. But of course, there are root causes to everything. And so we're not going to mention absolutely everything in depth, but I did want to have a little bit of more context of some longer term causes for the revolt of this summer, the summer of 19, as it's often referred to the most immediate issues that led to the revolt, which was the Chatgate. So let's start with colonialism. Of course, you can't talk about Puerto Rico without talking about colonialism. And what that means is that Puerto Rico is property of, but not part of the United States. Those aren't my words. Those are the words of the U.S. Supreme Court that stand today. Laws apply to the territory without consent of those living on the island of Puerto Rico and are enforced by federal appointees that are appointed by a political structure that is not consented by Puerto Ricans, right? There's no voting members in Congress. Puerto Ricans do not vote for the President of the United States. There is one non-voting member of Congress that, depending on who's in power in the House of Representatives, allows them or not to vote within committee. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens with the same rights and responsibilities when they live in the states, right? So when people say, what, Puerto Ricans don't vote for president? Well, it's like, technically you don't either. No one does, unless you're a delegate. So you get to vote for the Electoral College wherever you are, and the Electoral College is the amount of senators and representatives that you have, right? So if you live in Massachusetts and you're Puerto Rican, congratulations, you get to elect an Electoral College. If you live in Puerto Rico, even if you did, you get your Electoral College votes is the amount of senators and the amount of representatives, right? So that's 0. Entitlement programs like Social Security and healthcare programs can be capped because the territory is treated differently, technically not citizens. But an American who lives in the United States that moves to Puerto Rico, same rules apply, right? The territory is treated differently. The economy, it's the same U.S. market, access to the municipal bond market to borrow, same currency, the dollar, and it's very much an enclave economy. What that means is it's driven primarily by the investment of equity within the metropolis, within the United States. It's U.S. investment primarily to the benefit of those investors. This is a cartoon from the late 1800s, early 1900s And, it's kind of depicting, though I'm tying it into this, is it's not a coincidence that Puerto Rico is a colony. It is a product of policy, primarily U.S. expansionism throughout the world, which is also racialized. And this comic is a racialization of the treatment of the peoples that have been colonized through that policy, notably here Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, the Philippines, with a shout out to Native Americans there in the back and Chinese immigrants. But while we can talk about the past, these things, racism is very much alive and relevant to the present discussion in Puerto Rico. This man here, one of the most well-known white supremacist members of Congress until he retired and passed away in the early 2000s, is Strom Thurmond, a longtime senator for South Carolina. In 1984, he championed a measure in Congress, very little known until very recently. At the time it was known, but not in the recent past. To take Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., which is primarily resided by African Americans, outside of the normal bankruptcy procedures in federal court, and therefore Puerto Rico and DC don't have a normal way of declaring bankruptcy if they can't pay the debt. That'll be relevant soon. And other policies also affect Puerto Rico disproportionately, such as the Jones Act, which in fairness has a whole bunch of stuff that is just about maritime law. But one of the things that it also has is that it says that anything that gets transported between U.S. ports has to be transported on a U.S. vessel by the U.S. Merchant Marine, which is the most expensive in the world. That disproportionately affects Puerto Rico. Use the Virgin Islands as exempt, but Puerto Rico is not. And so that costs Puerto Rican consumers over $500 million a year, and some estimates have it at a lot higher. It also leads to, colonialism also leads to very quirky politics. The political system there is not divided by Democrats and Republicans. The party system there is very much aligned with the status options with relation to the United States. So a statehood party, an independence party, and a party that is, depending on who's in power, either more the status quo or some form of autonomy. And so Republicans and Democrats occupy the same political space within the party system, which is somewhat odd and quirky. It also leads to some odd Faustian bargains, right? So in 1996, this man on the bottom is Pedro Rosselló, the father of the recently departed Ricky Rosselló. He struck a bargain with then President Bill Clinton. Clinton was aiming at closing tax loopholes to balance the budget. And so they found Section 936 of the Internal Revenue Code, which I don't imagine anyone is very well versed in Section 936, but it was essentially the motor for the Puerto Rican economy, which led to most of the investment in manufacturing and propping up the banking system from U.S. capital. Pedro Rosselló gave up Section 936, not that it was his to give up, but he wasn't strategically not advocating for it and actually advocating for it to be eliminated, because the bargain was Puerto Rico was going to be fully funded, which currently and never has been, for the public health care system, and in universal health care, which Bill Clinton was going to pass, Puerto Rico would be included. That never happened, but Section 936 was taken off. So let's take a look at 40 years of economic activity by the numbers of the government of Puerto Rico. Chart starts out in 1980, so the creation of Section 936 is outside of the chart. Imagine it's around here. The gray areas denote recessions. Recessions in Puerto Rico in particular, they correlate with the recessions in the United States, except you'll see the recession in Puerto Rico, the last one, has essentially run for 13 years. This period here was the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. But you'll see that a couple of interesting things. 1984, when Puerto Rico was excluded from debt relief, the economy kind of flattened out for a little bit, then it rebounded. You'll see Section 936, when it was eliminated, it actually phased out over time. So where you see the economy going really hot, it kind of slows down a little bit. Companies figured out ways of extending some benefits, switching into doing accounting mumbo jumbo, that kind of thing. But in 2005, it actually ends at the end of 2005. And once that ends, oh my God, look at Another interesting part of what we can see here is we can see the effect of hurricanes on the economy. So the big hurricanes, Puerto Rico is hit almost every year by something, or it gets grazed by something. But the big hurricanes, category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes that where the eye made landfall, you'll see Hurricane Hugo in 1989 was devastating. Look at that drop in economic activity. Look at Hurricane George in 1998. That was horrible, category 4 direct hit. Look at Irma and Maria. Compare that. All right. Now, this also correlates with the economic conditions on the island, right? Particularly the debt. So as economic conditions go down, it's less revenue for the government of Puerto Rico. There's no toll gate tax that's related to Section 936 as well. So there's a lot less revenue in the government, and there was the politics of the island really led to continuous borrowing. There's a level of responsibility that the political structure in Puerto Rico has to take responsibility for, and that every one of these bars represents one governor administration, and the stuff in the red is how much they increased the debt. The stuff in the green is the cumulative debt until it reached the $72 billion mark. So debt was increasing, stuff was being used, money was cheap in the municipal bond market. So debt was being used to cover some costs that weren't capital. It wasn't capital expenses to improve the economy, but it was operating expenses as well. So it came a point where you really can't pay the debt back. And one of the other quirks about colonialism is our Constitution, the Puerto Rican Constitution, needed to be approved by U.S. Congress by vote. And one of the provisions that had to be there was that constitutionally, Puerto Rico has to pay off its debt first. It cannot, by its own accord, declare bankruptcy and say, sorry, I can't pay you. I am going to pay teachers first. You can't. Therefore, you have to pay debt service first. So that's this graph. This is debt service in, I'm sorry that I cut out the year, but I think it's 2005 from where I grabbed it. Debt service in an annual budget was that, and then compared to the Department of Education, compared to the health plan, the healthcare plan, the University of Puerto Rico system, and the police department. Right? So it's crowding out services. This quote here is from Antonio Weiss, who was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury back at the end of the Obama administration, at the Puerto Rico for Puerto Ricans Summit, which is actually taking place now in New York City. He said this 3 years ago: 20% of all housing on the island is vacant. Government pensions will run out of money in 3 years. 4 out of 18 bond issuers on the island are in default. Central government out of cash. 4 out of 5 Puerto Ricans expected to get Zika in the coming years. Humanitarian crisis has only begun, and the future of Puerto Rican people is imperiled. This is in the context of discussing how is the United States going to open up a way for Puerto Rico to declare bankruptcy so that all the money didn't go to pay back the debt and nothing for services, right? What was also happening there was for the first time in 100 years, the Puerto Rican population started going down. That hadn't happened in a whole century. But starting 2005 through 2015, Puerto Rico saw after Washington, D.C., the second jurisdiction with the biggest decrease in population. And that only continues and has been worse since Hurricane Maria. In this graph, it's 9.1% decrease in population. But that continues. So that's a vulture. That's my segue into how to pay the debt back. So you know, there's in a capitalist system, there's a very genuine concern about, like, okay, so if you don't pay back bondholders, you know, bondholders aren't necessarily these evil people with monocles, right? Like, bondholders are probably most of you, whether you know it or not. If you have a 401k, if you have a pension plan, right? Like, I don't know who has a pension here. I do. I work for City of Holyoke. There's a retirement plan. So pension systems own stock, and that stock owns bonds. And so people say, well, you have to make sure that the bondholder is repaid, right? And so how unfair that the government of Puerto Rico has taken out all this money and they just want to get out under it. That is a great argument that just doesn't hold up because of vultures. So what happens is that when people understand that a bond is worthless and is unlikely to get paid, vultures show up and they say, oh, okay, this is dead. I'm going to buy it on cents on the dollar. So vultures could buy it at 10 cents on a dollar, 10% of its value, right? And then hold most of these bonds, and then they turn around and they invest heavily in the political system, right? They invest in congressmen and women, senators, representatives, to create policy that would force bigger payments. So maybe they'll still get paid at cents at the dollar, but maybe they'll get paid at 40, 50 cents, 60 cents on the dollar. All that spread between what they paid and what actually gets paid by the government is their pure and unadulterated profit. And that's Promesa. All right. So Promesa is, it means promise, which is messed up. But it stands for Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act. So the legitimate need for Promesa at the time is there's no way, legal way, of Puerto Rico going bankrupt, which it had to. There was no way the government of Puerto Rico was going to pay back its debt. But what it also created was the Fiscal Control Board, what's often referred to as La Junta, because in Spanish it's Junta de Control Fiscal, but in Latin American history, a junta is also a military dictatorship. So at that point in time, it was like going back to old school colonialism, right? Where it wasn't like there was even there's still an elected governor, but everything of substance still had to be approved by this board. And you might have noticed a lot of black and white flags that have been used over the last couple of years. That's where this starts, right? Where it's like when the corals die and they bleach out, it's like people started bleaching out the flag and using the black and white. In that context is that Ricardo Rosselló gets elected in November of 2016 in the most divided electorate in memory, right? There were two independent candidates, not that broke off from the party system. They weren't politicians, they weren't elected officials, they weren't even appointed officials. And they got 16% between both of them. The second party didn't even crack 40%. And Ricardo Rosselló got the least amount of votes for winning governor in history. He couldn't even get to 42%. So people were already divided and looking for an alternative of the traditional party system. And even a new party, Partido del Pueblo Trabajador, the Workers' Party, had also joined in. So the years after 2016 to today were marked by a lot of activism on several different fronts. As usual, not just in Puerto Rico, led by student activists fighting austerity at the University of Puerto Rico. It's marked by a lot of closures, school closures. That's one graph from the New York Times. Every dot is a school closed, elementary or high school or middle school closed over the last couple of years. Which isn't just a matter of like logistics, right? Because once it's closed after a while, like you can't just reopen it. It degrades, and then you have to invest a lot to get it up and running. It's also worth noting in 2016, September 2016, 1 year before Hurricane Irma, the power system collapsed because of deferred maintenance. There was a big fire. This is the transformer yard right next to the biggest power producer on the island. There was a big fire. The power generation station went offline. Every other generation station has to pick up. They all warm up too much. Each one of them starts dropping like dominoes. And there was a blackout that lasted weeks. Up to that point, the longest blackout in U.S. jurisdiction history. Going back to activism on the island and amongst diaspora communities around human rights, particularly the freeing of Oscar Lopez Rivera, the last political prisoner from Puerto Rico. A lot of LGBTQ activism as well, combating discrimination and discriminatory policies in Puerto Rico. A lot of advocacy around feminism and gender, in favor of gender education in the educational system, but also fighting a consistent and high wave of gender violence against women on the island. And a lot of environmental activism protecting natural areas and beaches. So all that is going on at the same time. When in 2017, September 6th of 2017, Hurricane Irma comes, and the projection was initially that it was going to hit Puerto Rico. Thankfully for Puerto Rico, that did not happen. It absolutely destroyed some of Puerto Rico's neighbors. Look how massive that was. And this is a Doppler radar which indicates, which shows the rain for Hurricane Irma. An entire series of this is not available for Maria, though, which hit 2 years ago today. And the reason why it doesn't exist is because Hurricane Maria actually took out the Doppler radar in Puerto Rico as it made landfall. That didn't even happen in Bahamas. It made landfall as a technically Category 4, 155 miles an hour. And the worst thing that it did when it hit was take out the remnants of the electric system that was already damaged a year before, that was already damaged during Irma. So this became, that's the lights before the storm. And that's the satellite imagery of light coming out after the storm. Now, what was there after the storm doesn't necessarily represent the parts of the system that are still up. It's just a lot of it is generators, right? Hospitals and first responding places. But this lasted, that's 6 months, and most rural areas are still dark. I'm not gonna go through the whole thing. It's like a 3-minute long video. So, I mean, that kind of sums it up. Like, I don't think you need to even say anything there. I mean, it's just dejection, shock, loss. And most people were uncommunicated as well. No power, no phone lines. I mean, the government wasn't even prepared with satellite phones. It's just ridiculous. FEMA wasn't prepared for satellite phones. And so the diaspora communities, Holyoke included, it was like you weren't connected to a very important part of yourself. And so there was a lot of also mobilization. Miriam was part of that here, and a lot of you, I bet, were part of all the mobilizations that happened here in the States. Another iconic image from Puerto Rico at the time, which kind of calls back to a similar image during Hurricane Katrina, SOS, we need water, we need food. Right? And just the government was not able, the local government, municipal governments, and the federal government were not able to respond adequately. But this is my favorite image from that era. A cool thing about this is that I actually referenced my own Facebook because I had already created all this stuff in real time. This is my favorite one. It says, the crisis couldn't handle us, and Maria won't either. And so when we think about the summer of 19 with people chanting, we're more and we're not afraid, I think back to this image because it speaks to the resiliency of the Puerto Rican spirit of fighting back and fighting back. And not just resiliency for resiliency's sake, but in a modern era where we're so accustomed to being consumers of everything, of consumer goods, of our own entertainment, or even the services that we receive from government, people really had to work themselves to do everything, right? There's no water. You have to work on how you're going to create systems of piping to have water. How are you going to get people to whatever doctor or medical care that you can? So, logistics and transportation, getting food, sharing phones, sharing generators, but for months on end. I mean, this is common for like a week or two after getting hit by a hurricane, but for a very, very long time. And this is my opinion that I think that also generated the type of social capital that was needed for the type of activism that was seen this summer, which apparently no one coordinated, but was executed flawlessly. Meanwhile, that was the image of the minimization of the peril of Puerto Rico. And that's the effects. This here is Ceiba, that's Roosevelt Roads. It's underneath that tarp and those millions of gallons of water, it's a runway. And that's water that 20 minutes from there were communities that were going thirsty. And that water was just there. It was just never distributed. There's another similar location where there are found waters in private farms in Dorado. There are, how do you say furgones? I forgot all my English. I've been on paternity for 4 weeks.
Cargo freight?
Yeah, cargo freights with food and supplies that were also found later on. They were never distributed. And then the dead. So the hurricane itself, the wind, the floods didn't kill more than maybe 24 people. But the lack of electricity and healthcare and food and sanitary conditions, no one knows the number specifically, but one of the best estimates out there was around 4,600 people. That's a number you'll often see referenced. And this picture in particular are freight containers that are filled with bodies, because due to the legal process of declaring someone deceased and identifying the victims, it has to go through Ciencias Forenses, the forensic sciences department, and they ran out of space. They had no more fridges, so they had these freight containers filled with bodies. And that was the image of Ricardo Rosselló when Trump came to visit. All right. So actually, a lot of people just, we're all human. Like, okay, so he's starstruck, the president is there, whatever. Who cares? A lot of people gave him the benefit of the doubt, right? Like, stuff is hard, you're deeply in debt, right? And you get hit by a Category 4, Category 5 hurricane. Are you going to say he's the worst guy in the world? But that was an image that lasted. And throughout, after that, there was still confrontation because there was still austerity, there were still cuts in services. This is from a 2018 protest, worker and student protests, still confrontations with the state. And that sets the stage for 2019. In early 2019, the Secretary of the Treasurer resigned in January of 2019. She said, irreconcilable differences with the governor. Didn't elaborate, left. The governor names his chief of staff to run the Treasury. So this is right-hand man. His name is Raúl Maldonado. Now this man is not clean in his own accord. He also hired his son to do many things in both the Treasury and the Administration and Finance Department. But one day on June 24th, it was a Monday, for whatever reason he blurted out to the press that there's a mob controlling the Treasury Department. And by 1 p.m. he was summarily fired by his boss. And his boss, Ricky Rosselló, right, the governor, he said it was because he was never told about it. If there was a mob, why didn't you tell me? What's interesting is then Raúl Maldonado, the son, right, this is not the older gentleman, the guy who had all the contracts, like this just played out in real time on social media. It was the most interesting thing to see. This guy starts going into detail about what the governor knew and how corrupt he was. And so, people were just like eating popcorn. It's like, oh, yeah, it's like more political drama. But a couple of days later, the FBI arrests the, until very recently, Secretary of Education, Julia Kelleher, which was one of the most unpopular secretaries, of course, because she's shutting down all these schools. And something that's just eerily reminiscent of the 90s. Ricky Rosselló's father, Pedro Rosselló, had the most corrupt administration in history. He had 72 indictments. But the most prominent indictment, and in fact, the guy lost in court, he went to jail, was the Secretary of Education for pay-to-play purposes. So they arrest her for the same thing, and they arrest the executive director of the government health plan. So at that point, people are like, they're done. They're like, seriously? We're bankrupt? We have a fiscal control board, and people are playing the same old game and being corrupt. Calls start coming up for, you just have to resign. So on July 10th, in fact, in a reply to someone just saying, hey, you got to resign, the hashtag Ricky Renuncia is used for the first time. July 10th, on a reply. That's all it said. It just said Ricky Renuncia. And right after that, 889 pages of a Telegram chat magically gets filtered. Raúl Maldonado was on that chat, by the way. We don't know where it comes from. He says it wasn't him. So who's on that chat? It was like 11 people. As I said, Raúl Maldonado was on there. The Secretary of State was on there. The governor's best friend was on there, who's also the director of his campaign, who was also a lobbyist, who was also a contractor for a whole bunch of stuff. It was like, it was a bro club of just guys that were saying sexist, homophobic, racist, classist comments in real time. I mean, this is just, how stupid can you be? They were commenting on everything and stuff that was, if not illegal, they were definitely unethical, and showed the character of what they thought of even the people in their own party. They literally said in one of these, it's like, wow, good job. We're taking even our own people for suckers. At the same time that they're commenting on the dead of Maria. They're making fun of the dead, right? They're making light of it. It showed campaigns to buy off the press and positive press coverage at a time when people have, given the guy, if not a pass, the streets weren't burning when everything else was happening. And coordinated social media attacks to take down the reputation of political opponents, whether they were in their party or not. So people are incensed on social media. They can't even believe. I mean, one of the jokes is that people say, like, oh, they say Ricardo Rosselló hasn't done anything for education, but in fact he has an entire nation reading on a Sunday. I mean, people are reading 900 pages. And I don't know if anyone knows who San Benito is. Does anyone know who San Benito is on Twitter? Points? No? Bad Bunny, baby. Yeah. So Bad Bunny says, all right, hell with this. Let's go to the streets. Now, he's not the first one to say, let's go to the streets, right? In fairness, like, there's a whole activist community that were already in front of La Fortaleza, which is the governor's mansion. One of them being Alvin Cotto, studied together. And he says, oh, shit, Bad Bunny's saying, let's go to the streets. And people went to the streets. That wasn't the first day, but it was representative of what we saw. That orange barricade is behind those cops is the final part of Fortaleza Street, and then La Fortaleza, which is the governor's mansion. And folks just wouldn't go home. They would be there all day, all afternoon, through dinner, and all night. And that's what it looked like. It was festive, and it was passive. Until about 11 p.m. every night. Magically, 11 p.m. was the witching hour. Somehow, it was always someone threw something at 11 p.m. and gas containers would start flying, and protests would be broken up. Usually, it was one night would get like that. The other night was kind of like less intense. So one night on, one night off. You get the picture. Or the video in this case. So, just picking on Bad Bunny again. So he says, hey, let's do something big. And not only him, Ricky Martin was also part of this, and Residente. They were the three entertainers, a bunch of other entertainers and public figures added to this, but it actually started with someone just randomly posting, like, okay, on Monday, July 21st, we're going to take on like the major highway into San Juan. And I was so suspect. This is a trap. Because in 1999, there was this big demonstration for the peace of Vieques. And of course, I was like, nah, someone wants to trap everyone, because you're never going to get that many people to flood the highway. But then Bad Bunny did this, and then every artist said that. And people just started protesting everywhere, not just at Fortaleza Street, like in every town center, and in very creative ways. So that was the demonstration. It was the biggest demonstration on the island's history. 1 to 1.2 million people. There's only 3.2 million people left on the island. Like a third of the population is there. Some people just like don't have a car, or they're too far away. They're watching Netflix. I don't know, but like a third of the population was there. A lot of dramatic and artistic protesting, and then Puerto Ricans just took over everything by land, sea, and air. This demonstration was 3,000, a motorcade of 3,000 motorcycles, which, interestingly enough, the appearance or the wide belief is that public housing neighborhoods are all at war with each other because of drug wars. These guys went from public housing project to public housing project and kept gathering motorcycles with just one message, Ricky renuncia, Ricky renuncia. And they came up to Fortaleza at around 1 a.m. that day. rural towns just came in with horses, right? Because that's who they know. It's like, I'm just going to gather people. It's like, we're horse lovers. We're going to do the horses. And we love motorcycles. We're going to do motorcycles. We do canoeing. We do kayaks. We're going to do canoes and kayaks. So we took, that's Fortaleza right there. The Palace of Santa Catalina. Gorgeous. Go to Puerto Rico. Provide tourism dollars. And people they did that too. Then people were just like, I'm skydiving. I'm going to take an opportunity to send the message. And just, people everywhere. There's a campaign of people from all over the world just sending their pictures. This was my favorite. It was like a yoga Ricky Renuncia. I was like, what am I going to think of next? Jesus. So it was inevitable. Eventually the guy did have to resign. And in the waning minutes of July 24th, he phoned it in. He sent a video, and he said the words that he would be resigning. And then people just went exit. This is my favorite part. Someone had the fireworks ready. You hear that in the background? Someone had the fireworks ready. I don't think Puerto Ricans have ever been this coordinated on anything. Just like someone had the fireworks ready. What I also think is interesting is a quick side note. I really want to finish this so we can get talking. But July 25th is a very significant date in Puerto Rican history. It's the day that the United States Army entered the island, through the southwest through Guanica. So, depending on what you believe in terms of status, you either, you commemorate it or you celebrate it. July 25th is also the date in which the Constitution became official in Puerto Rico in 1952. Yeah, thank you. That's right. And Cerro Maravilla is what's called two independence followers were summarily executed extrajudiciously by official forces on July 25th. So they really wanted to resign not on July 25th, and so at around 11:40 something, quick, get the video out, and it wouldn't load. They were trying to load it on Facebook, and they loaded it for the 11:30, but on the 25th, it was they had already fired so many people because of Chatgate, including the Secretary of State and everyone, and people had resigned that just no one knew how to work a Facebook, and it was just hysterical because I'm just I'm there with my baby, and I'm they're not going to load it until the 25th. This is hysterical. But of course, they're the social media administration, and they didn't realize that's not how you actually resign, so they sent the official letter on the 25th, so, in my story, he resigned on the 25th. Anyway, that's a side note. But as I said, he had already fired the Secretary of State, who constitutionally is the successor to the governor. So his resignation was due on August 2nd, so he gave himself 2 weeks to pick his successor, or so he thought. And he appointed the guy who ran against him in the primaries, which is that man, Pedro Pierluisi. He appointed him in the last few days, in the last week before he left. And, he went through the confirmation process, but they were very non-committal as to whether the confirmation mattered or not. And as soon as 5 o'clock on Friday, August 2nd happened, he was like, oh, it doesn't matter. He swore himself in at his sister's house, that's his sister, with a judge, and he called himself the governor. He said, that's it, I'm the governor for the next year and a half. And no one had that. The Supreme Court unanimously said, no, you're not the governor. That's not how it works. And so they swore in the Secretary of Justice was third in the line of succession. And that's Wanda Vázquez, who everyone else also hated. There was already a campaign that said, Wanda renuncia. At the very end of this, because people realized when Ricky was going to resign, I was like, wait a minute, so who are we going to have? Oh, Wanda? Oh, the person who didn't investigate these corruption scandals, who gave these people a pass. There were leaked stuff on her as well that were not flattering, at least to be kind. And so Wanda renuncia was already taking shape. So as that was taking shape, the president of the Senate, this man, Tomás Rivera Schatz, was trying to take over the governorship, either for himself, the rumor said, or someone else. This person, Jennifer Gonzalez, was the non-voting member of the House, the resident commissioner. And so this is actually from their big bad press event where they're saying, they're muscling up to get Wanda out there and to get her to appoint Jennifer Gonzalez as Secretary of State, so then the people will make her resign, right? Right? In the most masterful act of use of power that I could have imagined, the people left the streets and said, no, you want to get her out? You deal with it. And people left the streets and went to the plazas. And that's what's happening now. Today, every week, what's happening is that people are having assemblies in plazas all throughout Puerto Rico, going from protest to proposal. And what will come of that, I have no idea. I haven't been there. But it's a very interesting and organic process of shredding the political future of the island. And we'll see what that translates into politically in terms of power, electorally. That's where we are. I'll stop there. And if anyone has questions. Not everyone at once.
I guess I want to know a little more about what you think is next. What is the content of those conversations now at the level of the people on the ground? And I also have a couple of questions that are a little more kind of general. Do you think the vile words and acts of the president are affecting this moment and specifically the economic stability of the island? And second, what do you think is the influence of what this great drama in the history of Puerto Rico on the status debate?
Okay, so I detected 3 questions there. Yeah, so, do I think the president is affected? Yeah, I mean, the president affects everything, and I can't remember one good thing he's done. So, I mean, I'm not dismissing the question. I'm dismissing the man and the ideology behind him. Like, yeah. I mean, if you could imagine the worst partner you could have in government, then it would be someone like Donald Trump, who's a white supremacist, right? So, I think that kind of covers the spirit of the question. What happens next? I don't know, because I'm not a resident of Puerto Rico. So, I mean, that's not to say that I don't have a say as the diaspora, but. A few things are happening now. Not just like people. It's not just like people are only organizing in the plazas and creating documents and plans that'll sit on a shelf. The pressure is still real, but it's very real on other fronts, right? So Wanda Vázquez has been pressured into declaring an emergency on gender violence. Dozens of women are dying every month because their partners or their uncles or parents are like killing women. And Regino Soyo is just denied doing anything about it. There's a major land use plan that is before the Planning Commission that would really set the rules for large-scale development on the island for this generation and whatever's left on the island. Frankly, that's still pristine. And that's getting a lot of pressure. The governor's getting a lot of pressure on stopping that process, because if it passes as it is now, then it would take care of a lot of natural areas. So there's a lot of pressure on very specific things, and each victory, right, or each battle really improves the standing of people to create something different. How that translates electorally is to be seen. There's been every political party that has formed new in the history of Puerto Rico and been successful has been an offshoot of a prior party. That's just a reality. That's not my opinion, right? The New Progressive Party was an offshoot of the Republican Party, and the not Republican like U.S. Republican, just like they have long names and I can't even remember them. I already graduated. I don't need to. I got Google. I can look it up. So, is there an offshoot of a party now? Like, does the Popular Democratic Party, frankly, I like saying the Popular Democratic Party is neither popular nor democratic. The New Progressive Party is not new and it's not progressive. Is there an offshoot from that is more progressive? Like, does Carmen Yulín win and then she transforms the party or not? I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I would think that's a way in the traditional history of Puerto Rico that could happen. People seem to want to create a new party out of where there is none. So there's a Victoria Ciudadana that's starting now. There's a lot of headwinds because there's institutionalized partisanship. So I happen to think that it's not my ideal scenario, but the rationality in me thinks, not my heart, but my rationality tends to think that it would be maybe easier to transform a languishing party because that's what's happened before, rather than creating a new party. And the third thing was?
The status.
Does this affect the status or not?
That's just the neighborhood status. I mean, the independentistas have been here for a long, long time, but not going very far in terms of popularity. So, is there any change in there?
I wouldn't dare to guess without any real data.
What would you hope for?
I'm going to pass. I'm going to pass. Is there a question over here? Or over there? Yeah.
So I know nothing about Puerto Rico, so thank you for sharing that.
There's a lot of politicians on the island that know nothing about Puerto Rico. I'm kidding, I'm kidding.
So one of the things that, if you pointed out, that 10% of the population left between 2005 and 2015, right? A pretty good amount of them came here, right? So that means a lot to communities like Holyoke, who take in a lot of people from Puerto Rico. And it probably takes a long time for government to catch up to those types of communities. Do you expect that to continue into the future, and what does that mean, and how do we use policy to effectively combat that, right? Because part of the problem they're having is that people are leaving in droves, so if you can keep people there, it'll make things a little bit better for the whole community. So do we have a solution to that? Is there something being done about that?
You can't keep Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico without taking away their citizenship, right? Sure. So, people are free to go, just like, all of us are free to go down to Connecticut and buy medalla. No. Medalla is the Puerto Rican beer. Like, I gotta explain that joke because it's the Puerto Rican beer. It's never been available in the United States, but now they're selling it in Florida and Connecticut. So you can just, at any point in time, there's no visa check, right, to go to Connecticut. There's no visa check to come up here either. So it really becomes what becomes an attractor to keep people on the island, and the problem is really grim because the first people to go are the people who can, right? So the healthcare system, which wasn't great before, now you really lack specialists because for some stuff you only have a handful, 5 specialists, and then 2 retire and 2 leave. There's only 1 specialist for pediatric neurological thing, right? And it's like. And this is a question I have to ask my parents now. Like, okay, now you're 70. Now you're in your 70s. You're in your age where you're going to consume the most amount of healthcare in your life. Where are you going to do that? So your question is how does that affect communities over here? Frankly, the pirating of talent has been a boon for a lot of communities, right? So I mean, we can just talk about Holyoke, right? If Holyoke wants a bilingual teacher, you can get them competitively, right? Texas goes to Puerto Rico down to recruit teachers. In other states as well, the New York Department of Education goes down to Puerto Rico to recruit teachers. And if you're a teacher making $15,000 a year, right, like my sister, and you get offered a $60,000 a year salary, so I mean, I don't know.
So does it take a while for think about, I would assume a lot of the talent comes here, right? Like you said, more people who are able to leave. So people who have positions, people who are more educated are able to come here.
Well, let me explain that, right? So you said it better than I did. People who are able to leave, which isn't the same as people who have a degree leave, right? So a degree enables you in some ways, right? If you're a doctor, you still have to take, or if you're a lawyer. Actually, if you're a lawyer, you're more screwed than other professionals because now you have to pass the bar at the new state. So if you don't have the federal bar and you don't have contacts, like I have so many friends who are lawyers who are just stuck. But I mean, you can have a trade, you can be good at woodworking or plumbing, and people who can leave, yes, and they'll go to other people, to where does my cousin live? Oh, he's in Holyoke? That's where I'm going, because I know a community, someone who's going to introduce me to a community. So two things happen, interestingly, at the same time. Puerto Ricans in the United States have become they haven't just, I'm forgetting my words in English, but where traditionally Puerto Ricans have been in very few centers, like in New York City, in Chicago, right, in Boston. Now Puerto Ricans are just everywhere. But Puerto Ricans migrating will go to clusters of where Puerto Ricans live, right? Primarily Florida, because it's not cold. But to places like Holyoke, some communities in Texas and Philadelphia and Chicago and New York.
I think we need to add to that, you know, the piece on the waves of migration of Puerto Ricans to the mainland, right? And following that economic graph that Marcos had shared, the migration of Puerto Ricans, it's connected to that, but it also connected to the fact that the Puerto Ricans are being recruited by different companies, different sectors. They get paid for their flights, their stay for months at a time, to do the jobs that others in the mainland don't want to do. Very hard work, and so people who are not educated, who are in poor areas of the island, they get recruited and to come and do that work. And so that also has to do with the where we migrate, right? So here in Massachusetts and Connecticut, a lot of Puerto Ricans migrated to do farming and tobacco fields, and then they realized that they were working 12 hours a day in under the sun with horrible conditions. And they realized, wait a minute, I'm a citizen. I can actually come and live here, work here, and bring my family. And so they would settle around. And so that's how a lot of us came to Holyoke and Springfield, but also to Texas and to Alaska, you know, to deal with the salmon industry, and to other parts of the nation where our own people do not want to be part of.
No, absolutely right, and I would say across the, that's all of that is true, and I would say so. Migration waves have always followed recessions, always. There's always been, and climate migration, like what happened during Maria, particularly in Holyoke, where we welcomed 2,000 individuals, is also not new. That happened in Hurricane George. You know, City Councilor Gladys Lebron Martinez, who's been a longtime leader in Holyoke, she was telling me about how that happened during Hurricane Hugo in 1989 when I was only 6 years old. You know, so migration and back migration has been cyclical. In the 70s, when New York City was bankrupt, a lot of Puerto Ricans went back to Puerto Rico. So maybe with that, maybe towards a more productive answer, is the best way of making sure that Puerto Rico is healthy and vibrant and with population is making sure that, you know, it's not a collapsed economy for the people who live there, because people don't want to necessarily live in the United States. I mean, it's like, no offense, but there's also, I don't mean no offense to you, I just mean like there's this general notion of shiny city on the hill that everyone just wants to be in the United States. That can be very true in a lot of occasions, but like, I'd rather be able to form a life in Puerto Rico. I mean, I'm talking for myself, right? So, you know, people will go back if there's something to go back to. Yes?
Okay, thank you, Marcos. That was an amazing presentation. I'm with the diaspora, and I'm also a member of West Mass Boricuas. So we've been fighting basically for the liberation of Puerto Rico, because like Marcos said, it's a colony. So we have, now this is the time for elections are coming up, and this is what we need to get the people who either you're going for Democrats, whatever, you know, this, we need to get the point to them to let them know that people from Puerto Rico have been treated as a colony for such a long time. And due to the migration happening a lot was when the gag law Ley de la Mordaza. We could even have our own songs. We couldn't put our bandera in Puerto Rico. Now you were going to prison. That's why a lot of people started coming in, and that's how some of my family came over here. And then also because of Maria. But we have something that's called demandas, principales, the principal demands, and this is what we ask. And we want you to call your legislators and let the people who who are going to be voting that Puerto Rico is asking for this. We don't want to pay the illegal debt because it hasn't been audited, so it's illegal. We want a final. We don't want no more Puerto Rico to be treated. This is in Spanish, so I have to turn it in English. We don't want the United States to treat Puerto Rico as a colony. We want Puerto Rico to be free. There's no more, we want a stop to the austerity politics of Puerto Rico, who brought people and criminals like Julie Kelleher to the Secretary of Education. We don't want nothing like that anymore. We don't want no more privatization to the public services. No more the education to be reformed. And we want an economic model for the people that they can work, because before Maria happened, people in Puerto Rico were getting $4.50 as a payment an hour. That was the minimum wage in Puerto Rico. And when the junta came, Puerto Rico wasn't ready, and the junta didn't do anything for the infrastructure, and that's why we have 4,645 people. And the last thing I want to say, when we were doing the Ricky Renuncia March, we had to say, Ricky renuncia y llévate a la junta. So this is what we need to talk to you legislators. And like I said, I remember Western Mass Boricuas. You can come and talk to me, and we also, you can be part of it too. That's it.
Thank you. Other questions, comments, clarifications, insults? Yeah.
Thank you, Marcos. I'm very proud you bring this information to us. You did a great job. And you ended up talking about Asamblea del Pueblo. I was there this summer, and I participated one of them. Asamblea del Pueblo is to empower the community, led by the citizens, and which they get together to bring a concrete idea in order to have a better Puerto Rico. And it's happening in 78 cities in Puerto Rico. And day by day, it's getting stronger.
Which one did you go to, by the way?
And Caguas, Puerto Rico.
Caguas. Okay. The
Day
new
by
country,
day,
that's what they call it.
yeah, day by day they get stronger. Like I say, it's empowerment to the community. They get together, and they bring ideas, concrete idea, to become a better Puerto Rico, and it's getting stronger for the 78 cities in Puerto Rico. Another thing that you don't brought it up.
So wait, you brought this up, so now I got to ask you, because you were there, and it's very exciting. So, I imagine a lot of it is like, oh, we should do this for education, we should do this for...
It's led by the citizen.
Right.
It's not political involved anything. It's led by the citizenship, by the community. And they bring ideas, they write it down, and then they get together, and they ended up with idea.
So beyond the discussion, like during the meeting, did you see any type of like early infrastructure on like political organizing beyond that?
No, like I say, it's led by the citizen. They try to end up with a common goal. And then when they have a common goal, they get together. And the purpose of that is to improve the living of Puerto Rico in general.
Is there an agenda for implementation of any of those goals that you could see?
No, you just raise your hand and you have idea, they write it down. And then everybody, it's a democratic point of view. Everybody had their own opinion and willing to, and it's happening every other week in Puerto Rico. Now, leaving that on the other side, you don't brought it up about, according to the New York Times, it's about 3,000 people living without roof in Puerto Rico. Could you please elaborate a little bit more about that?
So I don't have all the details on it, but I think what you're referencing is that there's still about 3,000 homes that, they lost their roofs, right? And
30,000.
Oh, 30,000, I'm sorry. So these are the blue tarp houses, right? So usually, so in Puerto Rico, they call it the FEMA tarp. It's the blue tarp when you lose your roof. That's meant to be a temporary condition that lasts, maybe a couple of weeks until you can get a contractor to put another roof on. And to this day, 2 years later, there are still, you said 30,000 units, that's still, all they have is a blue tarp on it. Right. So, right, and everything that comes with that, like, yeah, your house isn't decked out and just has a blue tarp. It's symbolic of your house is just unoccupiable, right? Yeah, it's horrible. And this goes to, someone mentioned the president early on, where he just keeps saying that there's been $92 billion that's gone to Puerto Rico. $92 billion is the estimated sum of the damage. That is what's $92 million. What's been approved is far less than that, and what's been transferred is $14 billion. But that's not to say that $14 billion has been spent. It's just that it's been transferred. Over here in the new. Yeah.
What's the status of the housing for the new arrivals in Holyoke? Or do they all have homes? Or what is the city and state done or can do?
Yeah, no, good question. So when people arrived here, just like when people are migrating due to climate, they're going to places where they know someone. By and large, I'm sure there are exceptions. So people are arriving here to stay with friends and family. So initially the housing situation was someone was staying temporarily. People wanted to stay longer. There wasn't enough supply. And where there was supply through the private market, they were asking for stuff that people didn't have. Can you show first and last, can you show income? It's like, no, I can't. I just got on a plane, man, because I had diabetes and I needed insulin. Some folks were able to access supply around here, like Chicopee or Springfield, but people, not everyone stayed, right? Like I can tell you, my parents stayed here for 3 months with me, and then they went back, and a lot of people did go back. Some of the estimates, by the way, are about 250,000 people left Puerto Rico right after the hurricane, or over that first year, but many of them went back. So the problem that Massachusetts in general has, not just Holyoke, is that we have a big shortage on housing, and the wait list for affordable housing is well known throughout the state. That's why Charlie Baker, even being a Republican, is like his number one, number two, number three priorities is like, we need to get this housing bill passed. And that's a combination of factors, not just economic. Some of it is political and has to do with zoning and NIMBYism in Massachusetts. I don't think there was a lot of options for like new arrivals where, unless you came here and you had money or had some other deeper support system, it was very hard for people to actually access housing.
We need to add that there's families that lived in hotels for almost a year or past a year because they did not have, either their family members could not have them in their own apartments or houses, or because they didn't know anyone. So that, I guess it's important to add that as well.
Absolutely, and all of that was a disaster in and of itself. Like the federal program to cover hotels, and FEMA, then they kind of like washed their hands of it, and they said, oh well, the governor hasn't activated it, and the governor, I could imagine like maybe he didn't, right? Like, what did he know? And then they activated it, but it's like, oh, funds are done. And then, the state of Massachusetts was actually very generous in that regard. They activated emergency funds to extend that period. Eventually it did, I think it was like the summer after, right? It went up to like June 30th. They extended it a couple of times. But yeah, eventually it did end. There was a question here, and then.
So, I like the fact that you talked about like U.S. intervention, because when you think about like Puerto Rican history and / also Latin American history, U.S. intervention has to do a lot with migration and immigration. So what is the role of the United States government, especially within Puerto Rico, within this movement that is both people-led, and these assemblies that are happening? Once these proposals make it to wherever they would make it, what is the role of the U.S. government within that? Because if it's coming from the people, then how is that going to be able to work with the U.S. government or the intervention, the constant intervention of the U.S. government, especially economically speaking?
I have a sarcastic answer and I have a real answer. So.
I have the sarcastic answer.
Well, I mean, sarcasm as a mechanism only works when there's like a ground of truth to it, right? So what has happened historically with organic system-changing proposals in the U.S. colonial context has been disruption and persecution. Oscar Lopez wasn't in prison because he liked the food, right? Like, so the modern intelligence system can be dated back to COINTELPRO, which monitored and persecuted activists in the Puerto Rican and African American communities, right, for liberation of their communities. So what role do they play? I mean, I can't say that they play that role. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. I can tell you that's been the history, and we can point to that, and we would hope it wouldn't happen again. I would certainly hope so. And that something would unfold democratically. If people want to convene democratically, as is protected by our Constitution, then people should be able to convene democratically and advance the ideas that they want to advance. What role should the United States play? And this is why I deferred on your status question, right? Because it's like it's so loaded, and I didn't want to like start Q&A with saying like this is my opinion on status. It takes two to dance, right? I guess you can dance with 10 people, but whatever. You can dance by yourself, but people want to know. It's not enough to just vote on what your favorite status is, like you're voting for American Idol. It's like you have to know like what the repercussions are, right? So if you favor statehood, right, then what is that transition like? And just purely, what is the transition? What are we giving up? The United States is one nation under God, right? So are we not going to be a nation? Because Puerto Rico has a national identity. So what does that mean? I certainly don't know what it means. So I would, we would want to know what does that mean? How many representatives are we getting? How many senators? We're getting rid of the Olympic team. That may be a worthy sacrifice if your ideal is statehood. That's fine, whatever. But what does that mean? If you're for independence and you want to be a republic, okay. So who's delivering the mail the next day? Like there's just, I don't know who's delivering the mail. There's no mail system, so. Is there a transition period? Do we still have access to the U.S. market? Because we're an enclave economy, so the next day, are you selling your goods and services? Are all these U.S. corporations leaving? Or not, because U.S. corporations are everywhere, right? And other countries use the dollar, so maybe that's not a big deal. But these things have to be drawn out. When you have more autonomy or freely associated state, what does that mean? And so that's usually what people mean when they talk about having a constituent assembly. It's having a set of proposals well-defined and detailed as to every status. It's not really like, it's not a product that you take off the shelf. Maybe statehood is easier to define like that, but the others aren't, right? And so if you want to be a freely associated state with the United States, you have to understand whether the United States, in its exercising its sovereignty, wants to be freely associated with you or not. And if you want to be an independent republic, you can do that. You can revolt, and like most countries just revolted and left by their own accord. That's fine. But if you want to have a country that's still associated economically and peacefully with another country, then you have to kind of understand those things. Ask Great Britain. They're going through that now. They're exercising their sovereignty, but the European Union is too. So I think that's the legitimate role for that.
Yeah.
I think we have one more. Can we take one more, or are we being kicked out?
This is really quick. I think I just missed it, but you talked about that chat gate.
Yeah.
When did that actually come out? Did you say?
Let me know whenever you know. Yes, that's right. So the Center for Investigative Journalism in Puerto Rico, Centro for Periodismo Investigativo, they leaked it at like 2 a.m. on a Saturday, or I guess technically it was Sunday, but everyone read it on the Sunday. And it was leaked in 2 waves. So the first wave was like 2 days before that, and 11 pages or so came out. And it was unflattering, but not illegal. Like it called Melissa Mark Viverito, the former speaker of the New York City City Council, it called her a whore, you know. But then like the full chat was leaked. And so where did it come from? Was it hacked? No, it probably came from one of the people who were in the chat, and the only person who was on the outs was the father of the kid who was yapping for the past 2 weeks and already had a lawyer. So that's my take, and that's what most people probably think, but technically we don't know.
The father of the kid.
So the Treasury Secretary, Raul Maldonado, he's the one who said there's a mafia running the Treasury, and then the governor fired him. But he'd hired his son to do a lot of stuff, so no one's clean.
So we can continue the conversation. This is wonderful, but we have to get out of this room. And there's actually food down in El Centro. So you're invited to come down and grab some food. I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for being here. Thank you, President Royal, for coming. And please, let's go down and have some food and have more conversation. Thank you.